some degree. When I say active, I mean that it can be readily called upon and used on demand, right? And of course, that's something translators and interpreters do quite often. To give you an example of a well-cited study that shows this competition and activation simultaneous is an eye tracking study by Marion and Spivey. And they showed Russian English bilinguals 4 different pictures on the screen. All they had to do was listen to a name of one of those pictures. It could, in a certain block, it was in the first language, in another block, it was in the other language. So all they had to do is just choose the picture that matched onto the word that they heard. Well, of course, like in psychology, we like to have some manipulations in tasks. So the manipulation here was that one of those, so there's one right answer, right? They hear marker and they see a picture of a marker, but there are 3 other pictures. One of those 3 is a distractor item. That distractor has some sort of sound overlap with the other language, something in the other language. So in this case, the word stamp in Russian starts with mark. I don't know the full word, actually, I don't speak Russian. But that overlap in Russian, mark, and the word marker, we saw that the participants would look more often and longer at the picture of a stamp rather than the cup and the chair. So this shows us that there's something drawing their attention as they sift through this information. There's something drawing their attention to a distractor. And that was, of course, the critical conditions. And this suggests that we have co-activation, parallel activation of 2 languages. And it wasn't done just in one language, but it was done in the other direction as well. So you may have heard of this, this ongoing debate of the bilingual advantage, and they're using this notion of co-activation and competition of 2 or more languages in the mind to suggest that this is the mental exercise that is sharpening other cognitive functions. And the specific, these are just a few examples of what I mean by executive functioning or cognitive functions that we have as humans. This would include things like inhibitory control, my ability to control irrelevant information and stay on task, for example, working memory, which we've seen a lot today in the conference, and cognitive flexibility. That would be like switching between tasks. And the research shows that bilinguals compared to monolinguals, seem to do better on certain executive functions. Other research does not find that, though, and that is the ongoing heated debate that we have in the field. Now, if we see that other professions, from their daily practices, also have, let's say, a benefit in working memory, then we might want to suggest that bilinguals and multilinguals who also engage in unique language practices may also have this advantage. So taxi drivers, there have been studies on playing video games and actually juggling, not juggling mentally, but juggling balls. This is showing an effect. Now, I'm going to give you a few examples from, I have several colleagues in China that I work with, and I'm going to give you 3 different studies that we've published over the last few years to show when we train a bilingual to do something, we can see the effect in the non-language domain. So we asked Chinese English bilinguals to learn a set of new words in Japanese and German. Here's what the task would have looked like. They see a fixation point. They then see a picture with an audio stimulus, and they respond, yes, this is the picture I hear, or no, it is not. And then a couple slides later, they see a flanker task. A flanker task, you see the 5 arrows that are pointing all in the same direction. At that point, the task is that the bilingual would have to respond to the center arrow. If it's pointing to the right, they click a button with their right hand. If it's pointing to the left, they click it with their left hand. What you see in front of you now is a congruent trial. If we had switched that middle triangle, that middle flanking arrow the opposite way, you see that there would be a disconnection between what they're responding to and what they're being distracted with. After 6 days of training them to switch between these new words that they have learned in Japanese and German, they improved on these flanker tasks. They got better at ignoring the distractors around them, and it sharpened their accuracy. We saw this was an EEG study, so we saw this in the electrical activity, specifically 200 milliseconds after that flanker task, we saw some effect. So we see a peak that was a little bit larger than when it was congruent. We also saw effects with the P3, and these two typical natural electrical activities of the brain represent certain things. What do you think it would represent right when the picture or right when the flanker is being shown? It would represent the detection of what am I seeing in front of me. So this is a stimulus detection we would see within 200 milliseconds. And then about 100 milliseconds, or 1/10 of a second later, their mind would do something else. They would need to resolve some conflict, memory updating, and other things. So that we saw these effects in the EEG. So it wasn't a behavioral study with reaction times, but it was an EEG study. And we see that the ability to control language and switching between the two languages actually improved their executive function in this case at the very beginning of language learning. And another study we conducted, another intensive training in language switching, we wondered if another area of the executive functions is decision-making, rational decision-making. And if you think when you go gambling, and maybe this is the appropriate place to talk about it, right? I would suggest gambling in your first language. Have someone stand by you and talk to you while you're gambling, because that will actually have more rational decisions. There is an effect when we make decisions, make gambling choices and other things, you're more sensitive to emotion and decisions in the first language. So after they were trained to switch between their languages based on the color cue they see. So if it's a blue square there, the picture they see, they have to name it in their first language, maybe Chinese. And if it was a red square, that tells them to name it in the other language. We asked them then to participate in the Iowa gambling task. It's a kind of 4 sets of decks that you see, decks of cards. And we compared a group that did the switching first and a group that did the switching second. Did that have an effect? It did. This is another ERP analysis that we conducted. So who made the better choices? Who had more wins and less losses? Those who had been trained to switch between their languages. So another indication here that language control can affect other areas of cognition. Unfortunately, we have a lot of variables that can skew our results. Genetics is one of them. You may have heard of the FOXP2 gene before. And a very well-cited study was about a family that had, all throughout several generations, they had the same language impairment. They had a speech impairment. And that was related to a mutation in their FOXP2 gene. So in the news many years ago, we finally found the language gene. Well, it's certainly not that. It's not just one gene, of course, but we found other genes that can predict one's ability to control their language. Not only can we train them to do it better, but there's going to be even a genetic plus of doing so if they have certain variants in their genetics. So we first did the DNA extraction and then had them do that language switching tasks. And we found that so we specifically looked at 2 time points when they're doing their switching here. The N2, which we saw in the previous slide, is 200 milliseconds after they see the picture. And then we looked a little bit later on, which is the late positive component. That's over a second or a second and a half after the picture. All 4 of the genes that we had focused on predicted the ability to control languages. Specifically, however, the FOXP2 predicted later on in the process. In other words, the COMP, the BDNF, and the KIBRA, these genes facilitated stimulus detection, but the FOXP2 gene lasted a little longer. The effects we saw a little bit longer. So that little bit longer would be when the word is being retrieved, not when the language is being selected or the stimulus is being dissected. That was influenced by all four, but again, the FOXP2 is specifically important for longer stages of lexical processing. So this just gives us an example of how complicated it is for us to make claims about the effects of bilingualism when we even have genetic factors, typical language practices, and so many other things that are going to affect. And this is why I believe that there are lots of inconsistent results. We don't really have the full profile of autism. We're not going to ever be able to genetically collect their genetics and then add that into the description of the participants. That's beyond really what we can do. But at least if we know that this could be a factor, it's kind of it's a good thing, right? Now let's talk about what does this have to do with interpreters? Over the last 10 years or so, there's a theory you may have heard from Adolfo Garcia called the interpreter advantage. It's essentially the same as what we were talking about, that bilinguals, when compared to monolinguals, they seem to have, in some studies, certain areas of cognitive processes that are stronger. That's also been found in interpreters. The good news is that it is less contentious, there's less disagreement when we talk about an interpreter advantage. The bilingual advantage, some studies say, oh yeah, there is. Some studies say, no, not at all. But there are no studies, the other good point is there are no studies that actually say it's harmful for anything at all. Any bilingualism or multilingualism doesn't harm other cognitive domains. Well, what do interpreters do? If we look at this list that I'm going to give you now, and then ask yourself, are these things that non-interpreters do? Do they have on-demand bidirectional competence? They do, but it might not be as sharp and quick as an interpreter. Interpreters definitely have stronger language control abilities and working memory as well. They often will have a specialized set of vocabulary specific to certain fields. They need to have this deep cultural and contextual understanding of what they're interpreting. They also need to be careful, for example, in a court setting. You have ethical dilemmas and emotion can be involved. All of these things, and rigorous training and practice, all of these things, typical or non-interpreters do not really do these things, right? They don't necessarily possess all of these skills. And I believe these skills is what's driving more consistent results in interpreters versus bilinguals. I want to be mindful of time. I don't want to run out of time. And some of this, it's just probably, you already know the difference between simultaneous interpreting and consecutive interpreting. The results show that there is an advantage. There's an interpreter advantage. There are some advantages as well in consecutive interpreting. But one of them is more demanding than the other, right? In different ways, where consecutive interpreting may involve note-taking, which introduces another complexity, right? We have motor skills and other things that are being called upon. Simultaneous interpreters use these complex processes. They listen to language while simultaneously interpreting it. That is not the same as switching between the two languages, really, because they're using one modality and they're using another modality in another language. It's not quite the same. A well-cited study is Christopher's in 2006. They compared Dutch-English bilinguals, several groups of them, on working memory tasks. So the first experiment looked at professional interpreters and non-interpreter bilinguals. The second experiment compared professional interpreters and proficient L2 teachers. And in both cases, the interpreters outperformed the comparison groups here in speed, in accuracy, and in their working memory capacities. When we compared, though, interpreters and teachers, this is kind of expected, right? You would expect teachers of a second language to be highly proficient. In other words, they can have high speed, high accuracy, but they still didn't outperform the interpreters in working memory. So this is sort of, in 2006, people started paying attention to this type of finding, right? We're saying, well, wait a minute, maybe these are super bilinguals, we could call them. And this interpreter advantage hypothesis, I'll put a quote here in green boxes. Green, the color of the flag, by the way. Supposedly I chose the exact color, but it doesn't come out too well on the projector. But I'll read this to you. So this hypothesis says that certain cognitive skills that are developed by professional interpreters can be generalized to other domains, like executive abilities that are nonverbal tasks. Now, we have several studies over the last 8 or 10 years now that have done really in-depth comparisons between translators, interpreters, and very proficient bilinguals, and we see sort of this consistent result in some areas, definitely in working memory. In this particular study here, they were comparing monolinguals, translators, and interpreters, and on 5 different measures: updating, flexibility, resistance to inhibition, etc. And we see that the interpreters outperformed the monolinguals on all 5 measures. And they outperformed translators as well. Translators, as you know, typically work with text. Thank you. They typically work with text, less working memory demands, etc. So interpreters still outperformed translators on everything except for flexibility. And there was no significant difference between that. Another study looked at whether interpreters possess this benefit. I marked the significant areas with a little asterisk here. So we're comparing simultaneous interpreters with non-interpreter multilinguals that were matched in terms of proficiency. That's important to consider, right? And they outperformed the non-interpreter multilinguals on 3 of those areas of executive functions, but not on conflict resolution. Now we're starting to see some, what area or what cognitive function seems to actually show advantages. Now compare that study to the one you have below. No differences at all were found on these 4 executive functions here. So we see some inconsistency here. There was some short-term memory that was marginally significant, showing an advantage for interpreters, but we do have quite some inconsistent findings. Well, individuals started in the last 5 years asking, well, maybe interpreters who begin their program, they want to study something they're good at, they like, maybe they just have stronger working memory than other individuals who are not going to school to study. We all would like to do things that we're kind of good at, right? So that was asked. Let's compare at the very beginning of interpreting school to those who have more experience interpreting. So we have marginally better in working memory, but they were no better in the other executive functions that are in bold there for you. Another question that's been recently asked: does multitasking improve after time when we're training interpreters to be interpreters? And here's a very good study here that compared undergraduate interpreting students. They were just beginning, or they were in their first year, and they compared that to a graduate student group, so they had a couple more years of training. And there indeed was an advantage in this multitasking when they had received more, when we look at the group that had received more training. And the last question I want to show you is, does conflict resolution differ between interpreters and non-interpreter bilinguals? Over the course of the flanker task we were looking at, with the arrows that are pointing in the same way or not, both of the groups actually got better over time during the task. However, interpreters show a stronger advantage here adapting to conflict. So they both got better, but the interpreters got more better than the non-interpreters. And the explanation was they're facing cross-language competition, and they're able to mitigate that competition more efficiently. The last couple of slides here I can go through a little quicker because there's not much to say about this other than to look at meta-analyses and reviews that really underscore the fact that we have so many inconsistent findings in the bilingual advantage, as you see here, and also in the interpreter advantage. Several meta-analyses have been conducted recently showing that, we do have some inconsistencies here. And here are some of them in front of you. We have working memory, coordination, selective attention, and flexibility are the areas that seem to be most consistently showing an advantage in interpreters. But other studies, like the one you see here, show advantages in working memory and short-term memory, but not so much in other areas, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So now as you look through this list, out of all these reviews that have taken dozens of studies, which are the areas that seem to be most prominently suggesting an interpreter advantage? Working memory seems to appear on several of these reviews. But at the very bottom here, you see, I should go this one here. At the very bottom here, if you compare these last two reviews, the Noor et al. Showed an advantage in shifting and updating, but not inhibition. And then you see at the very bottom, only shifting, but not updating. So even our meta-analyses and reviews that are taking a mass quantity of data and doing some number crunching is showing that we have some inconsistencies here. So here is my conclusion here. We have what I've talked to you about so far. We have interpreters that are a unique type of bilingual that we have because of the unique practices that they engage with. The bilingual advantage hypothesis I mentioned to you suggests that the regular use of and training to switch between them seem to give rise to certain executive functions, but we can't pinpoint the exact ones. They're just all over the place right now. Interpreter advantage, though, is a little bit more consistent, at least stronger in working memory and shifting, but maybe not in other areas. So again, this is always but maybe. I think in the future, studies it's like I said earlier, it's really hard to get all the information about our participants, their genes, what they do every single day, who they engage with, all of these sorts of things. It's difficult to get that information, isn't it? But if we were to do so, I think we could get a little bit cleaner data and cleaner results, suggesting, I think we can now pinpoint what exact factor it is that is determining whether we find an advantage or not. So I wanted to leave my email up here, and if you're interested in my website, you can take a look at that. And while if we have time for discussion or anything, this is a wonderful little thing I found online. It's nice because it does say that they're superpowers and they've used a lot of the data from the bilingual advantage in there. This seems to show that there are no inconsistent findings, but this is a cartoon, so be careful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Schreiter, for your wonderful speech. Professor Schreiter's speech offers a complex, comprehensive exploration of the unique cognitive profiles of interpreters, skillfully weaving together insights from bilingualism and cognitive science. So it's really a fascinating and insightful talk. Let's once again thank him with warm applause. And next, let's welcome Professor Zhu Li, okay? Now to chair next keynote speech.
Dear colleagues, friends, good afternoon. Many thanks for Professor Li giving me this opportunity to chair Professor Ye Shengtan's speech. 9 years ago, I was a postdoc fellow here at the University of Macau in Professor De Fengli's team. I learned a lot from Professor Li, and I got much help from Professor Lee and all the PhD students during that time. So by this opportunity, I'd like to show my great thanks to all of them. Thank you. And it's a greatest honor also to introduce Professor Tan and to you. Tan is a professor and supervisor for the PhD program in translation studies at Shanghai International Studies University. And he works as a review editor of the Journal of Foreign Languages, a peer-reviewed Chinese journal in linguistics and translation studies. He's also a board member of Chinese Cognitive Linguistics Association, Chinese Cognitive Translation Studies Association. And Professor Tan's major academic interests are cognitive translatology, cognitive linguistics, cognitive stylistics, and corpus-based translation studies. He's now doing cognitive translation studies based on the semantically tagged corpus data and translators thinking portfolios. He has published more than 60 journal papers in linguistics and translation studies. And he also published multiple monographs in cognitive translation studies, such as Construe Across Linguistics, Cognitive Linguistics Approach to Translation. It's a good book for of theoretical construction in this field. And Prolegomena to Cognitive Translatology, Cognitive Parses and Constraints of Creative Translation. And studies on cognitive process in translation, and the multi voices of British and American sinologists come translators, a cognitive translatological approach to thinking portfolios of Chinese fiction translation. And Professor Tan's topic today is profiling in Chinese folk culture translation. So let's give a round of applause to welcome Professor Tan to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhu. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Professor Lee for the invitation, and also the organizers. Okay, the topic today is profiling in Chinese folk culture translation. I think I only can have 25 minutes to give the rough idea, okay, of the profiling theory. Okay. So first we talk about the notion of profile and the profiling theory of translation, and then I will give a brief introduction to the theoretical and practical implications of this of cultural translation and profiling. Okay, and then I will give you some cases of profiling in Chinese folk culture translation. So profile is is a very important notion in different fields or contexts. Just now, Professor Schwitter mentioned the interpreter's profile. Okay, so actually, it is a very important notion used in different fields. Okay, like a profile of a body figure in paper cut, painting, sculpture. Okay, and then we have a profile of subjects in experimental studies. We also have behavior profile in biology, animal husbandry, marketing, and criminal justice. Okay. So we have some profiling tools to help us to get the behavior profile based on a large data statistics. For example, racial profiling refers to the practice of creating different profiles based on racial differences. For example, the higher crime rate among black individuals leads to more targeted profiling, which reflects statistical analysis of behavioral patterns and aims to help avoid or eliminate systemic inequalities. Okay. So profile is polysemous, okay? But there is a common cognitive essence. That is, cognitively speaking, profile is the prominent substructure of or imposed on a conceptual base. So we want to get a profile of an interpreter, we must first select a conceptual base or contextual frame to know what kind of profile you can get. Okay? Like an interpreter's profile, you must know what kind of dimensions you can use to generalize the profile. Okay? So this is the cognitive nature of profile. Okay? And then we have the notion of profile in cognitive linguistics. In cognitive linguistics, an expression's profile stands out as a particular substructure in the specific focus of attention within its immediate scope in active domains. That is the portion put on stage and foregrounded as the general locus of viewing attention. It's basically an attentional phenomena, okay? So it's prominent in our attention, okay? Or within its maximal scope in all domains of its matrix. So when we talk about base, can be an immediate scope or a maximal scope. We have domains within the locus of our attention, within the focus of our attention. Okay. The relationship of profile to base at the level of lexeme is that of spoke to will. Here, will is the base and spoke is the profile. Okay. This is a very simple example to show what profile is. And this profile-based relationship can be applicable to discourse predications. So when we have a discourse segment, we also have profile and base. Okay. So when we propose the theory of profiling, actually we are based on our belief that it can clarify the cognitive foundation of translation. Because the concept of profiling can serve as a descriptive construct for translation, capturing the opposing phenomena in form and semantics when the source text and target text express the same conceptual content. So it captures the feature that translation is similarity within difference and difference within similarity. So, for example, 电脑 can be translated as laptop or notebook computer. Okay? These refer to the same thing, but their profile embodied attributes are different. So their profiles are different. Okay? This is a very common translation phenomena. Okay? And we have 4 basic cognitive profiling relationships between the source and its targets. First is same, similar profile, and same, similar base. And when we talk about equivalence theory, yeah, it is the ideal goal of translation equivalence, right? So the second one is same framework, base, and different profiles. It is also typical manifest. It is a very typical relationship between the source and the target. Okay. And a very typical manifestation of the same yet different and different yet same relationships commonly found in translation. Okay. And then we have different profiles, different bases. In this case, the relationship between the original text and its translation either does not qualify as translation. That means there's no direct relation between the source text and the target text. And also, there's another kind of relationship that is we can rebuild the relationship on a higher contextual base. Okay. That is the domain matrix or superordinate framework. by profiling a subframe related to the original text. Okay. And then the fourth one, we have same or similar profile, but different basis. This is a special cross-link with cultural phenomena. And Crofts and Cruz give us an example. Javanese word haza can be translated into English as feeling or meaning, but this only provide an approximate conceptual profile and doesn't activate the same cultural frame. And I also have another example that's in Chinese, Taoism, okay, Tao in Taoism can be translated as way, but it only carries the, provide an approximate conceptual profile, but does not activate the whole conceptual base. Okay. And profiling is foundational for various control operations because it is the most significant distinction, the most significant control operation within a whole system of control operations, as Langaker pointed out. Okay. When we conceive a situation from various perspectives, when we need to encode or re-encode the situation, it will inevitably lead to the selection of different control modes and profile different attributes and features within the activated cognitive domain or cognitive domain matrix. So profiling became a very foundational, becomes the very foundation for various control operations. And we have this figure to show the relationship between profiling and other control operations. Okay. Here, a very important notion is cognitive stacking. That means we usually activate other kind of control operations based on profiled thing, process, or relationship. Okay. I only have time to give you one example. That is metaphorical profiling. Okay. So, 老王是我们厂里的老黄牛. Okay. It is a metaphorical expression. Literally, 老王 is the old yellow bull in our factory. Okay. But actually, this is a wrong rendering, a mistaken translation. Okay. Because it involves the profiling of different cultural models or frames. Okay. 老黄牛, okay, the Chinese agricultural frame assigns the role of agricultural helper to the oxen, while metaphorically profiling the hardworking and diligent qualities of a person. Okay. In contrast, the English translation, bull, refers to the Western bullfighting cultural frame. So metaphorically profiling a fierce personality. So a better version would be 老王 is the old workhouse in our factory. Okay. So there is cognitive stacking between the metaphorization and the profiling. Okay. So this is a brief introduction to the profiling theory of translation. There are theoretical implications for cultural translation. It transcends traditional theoretic notions of binary oppositions, such as equivalence and domestication versus foreignization, and shifts our research focuses from previous studies. Okay, first, that is, previous studies viewed culture as a constraint on translators. Okay. And then earlier research may have focused more on culture that is lost in translation. And we have binary oppositional thinking when we use the terms equivalence, cultural equivalence, domestication, or foreignization. Okay? And we have a different understanding of foreignization in light of profiling. Okay? In many in postmodernist translation theories like the focus on and foreignization is highly valued, and giving much attention to how foreignization can be related to the inequality of power relations, and the manipulative role of ideology and the cultural reconstruction and reshaping. Okay. But cognitive translation studies reveal the cognitive essence and the mechanism of foreignization, which is the change or renewal of cognitive schemas in the target culture, specifically reflected in the translated diverse construal operations. Foreignization is manifested in the profiling of parts or elements of the source culture that are different from the target culture, leading to a renewal of cultural schemas. So this is the cognitive essence of foreignization. Now let's have an example. Okay, please pay attention to the two terms, 洞庭君祠, 水仙庙. Okay, in Lin's version, 洞庭君祠 is translated as God of the Tongting Lake. 水仙庙, Narcissus Temple. And in Black's version, Goddess of Tongting Lake, and Narcissus Temple. Okay, these two words seem similar because they both use domestication and foreignization strategies. Okay? But how do we explain the differences between these two versions? We can say that they profile different frames. In Black's version, it profiles the flower frame. Okay. In Lin's version, it may profile the fairy frame and also the flower frame. Why? Because Narcissus is a boy in the Western culture. He's a boy in the story, right? So when Black use goddess of the temple, so if it profiles the fairy frame, then there is a contradiction between the two terms. Okay, so we can say even if they use domestication and foreignization strategies, they show differences in profiling. This is the advantage of profiling theory, okay, in the description of different translation. Okay, and with cognitive profiling theory of translation, we can have open dialogue and integration of cultural translation theories. In terms of profiling, equivalence, whether as a prescriptive or descriptive concept, is an ideal goal that seeks to profile the multiple facets of the conceptual base at the linguistic level. That means as many facets as possible. That is the ideal goal. Okay. Foreignization, creative treason, and subjectivity advocated by various postmodernist claims place greater emphasis on profiling cultural elements or patterns with manipulative intentions. So this is the profiling theory provides opportunity or possibility to integrate different cultural translation theories. Okay. And then we have enlarged notion of cultural translation. Okay. In cognitive translatology, culture is not a highly abstract concept. It is not only environment or not only a condition for translation or constraint for translation, but also a mental representation. Okay. It is both supra-individual and present in individual mental representations. The cultural system is represented in the individual brain and integrated and partially shared within cultural communities. And the communication within the community is negotiated and coordinated based on shared cultural representations. Okay. And then his culture is also a source of conceptualizing experience through cognitive structures, including models, frames, schemas, categories, metaphors, and scripts. So focus on the cross-cultural mind, cognitive translatology aims to unify the studies on different levels of culture. And the theory of profiling highlights the transformation and the convergence of various aspects of the concept base, addressing different dimensions of cultural translation, including linguistic, social, ideological, and political, through a cognitive lens. It emphasizes the process by which cultural concepts or frames are represented through different kinds of symbols, whether it's visual, auditory, kinesthetic, or linguistic modalities across different cultural systems, allowing for an examination of the interaction among various factors within the broadly defined scope of cultural translation. Of course, it has practical implications. That is, we have a large variety of cultural translation practices which can be covered in our discussion. Okay. These may include multimodal intercultural conversion, explore how different modes of communication contribute to intercultural understanding and transformation. Okay. Consider examples like performance art, visual arts, or digital media. And we can also discuss historical migration of concepts, like the project initiated by Mona Baker. Okay. And we also have intercultural practices of immigrants. Okay. And lastly, the intercultural creations without original text. Okay. These different kinds of cultural translation practices can be discussed with from the perspective of cognitive translatology. Okay. So next, I will give you some examples to show how profiling, okay, 5 minutes, thank you. Profiling can help us to explain the Chinese folk translation cases. Okay. First one, an example from 6 chapters of Floating Life. Okay. Here, 坊间有蝴蝶旅，小大由之. Okay, 小大由之. Okay. In this version, it's fit any size of feet. But in Black's version, it's either can be worn with either bound or natural feet. So 小大, the closest equivalence would be little or big, right? But it is translated as bound or natural feet. So it evokes the cultural model, the traditional Chinese cultural model, that is bounded feet culture frame. Okay? And we also have profound shift in grounding when introducing Chinese cultural articles in museums or in cultural shows. When they describe the cultural article, in this book, the author give some more illustrations or more descriptions of the embodied experience. But in the translation, they are all deleted because when they view the picture, they can feel the article, and they have more embodied experience. And these embodied experience may not be shared, so they are valued. Okay. Another example, this is the red-green floral fabric. Okay. Okay, this is a situation when the fabric is the floral fabric jacket of floral fabric is wearing, and then we have suits of red-green floral fabric on Paris streets, and then we have wedding dress of red-green floral fabric on movie star stage. Okay. So in this case, we also have profiling. The profiling on different conceptual bases. We have same or similar profile of color configuration, red, gray, flower, right? But we have different bases. The jacket of Chinese folk design, the Western suits, and a Western style wedding dress. These are the different bases. So we have same profile imposed on different bases in different cross-cultural situations. Okay. So this example illustrates how cultural translation can be a form of embodied folk practice across cultures, because it gives us a new narrative of Chinese folk culture. Another example, okay. When the translator give a title to this figure composed of different figures of 八卦鱼, okay. And it is translated as 8-diagram fish. Actually, I think it's the translation give a wrong profile, because we have some pictures do not show the 8 diagrams, like the two figures on the up left. Okay. The base would be 8 diagram plus yin-yang configurations, and the linguist profile is the 8 diagram fish. But the visual profile only shows the fish, the yin-yang fish. Okay. There's no 8 diagram. So the translation. The translation is not wrong, but not appropriate for the different figures. Okay. In view of the target audience, the yin-yang fish may be the proper way of cultural translation in this case. Okay, we also have other examples. The last one, okay. In the last one, okay. In Mulan is a very is a folk story. Is a folk story in China. So has been adapted into animated picture, animated film, and also real person movie. And they add different figures to make it a mythological story. Okay, sorry. So actually, this example shows the different profiling on the great chain of being. We have different great chains of being. And in Chinese, there is an ancestor ghost. But in Western culture, there's a wizard. So they profile on different bases. Okay, my time is up. Sorry. So I think I can only give you a rough idea of the profiling theory, but later, I think there are room to do folk culture translation studies in this framework. Thank you.
Many thanks for Professor Asian Tan's very insightful and very interesting, informative speech. So as we know, as one of pioneers of cognitive linguistic approach to translation studies, so Professor Tan today gave us a new way of thinking about the marriage of the two disciplines, I think. So based on the theory of profile and base of cognitive linguistics, Professor Tan provides a very detailed explanation of the cognitive construction process of the cultural translation, especially in the folk culture translation. Very interesting example analysis. I believe we have learned a lot for the new thinking about the application of the cognitive linguistic theories and concepts in translation studies. Thanks, Professor Tan. Thanks. Okay. Next one. Professor Zhou, please. Yeah. Okay.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I thank Professor Li for giving me this opportunity to present to you our next speaker. Our next speaker is Professor Rui Xue. Professor Xue is the Dean and the Professor at the School of Foreign Languages at Wuhan University of Technology. And she serves as the Vice President of the Hubei Province Translators Association, as well as an Executive Council member of the International Association for Translation and Interpreting Cognition. She has led and participated in 5 national and provincial levels research projects. She has published 1 monograph, translated 2 books, co-edited 3 textbooks, and published over 20 journal articles. And Professor Xue is going to give us a talk on a study on the force dynamics between imagery construction and emotional cognition in English translation of Chinese poetry. Professor Xue, please.
Good afternoon, distinguished professors, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Thank Professor Zhou for the introduction, and thank Professor Li Defeng for giving me such an opportunity to share my ideas about cognitive study on the imagery retention and emotion change in the translation of Chinese classical poetry. In the previous speeches of today, we heard many times for empirical study, statistical analysis, and so on. I'm thinking one thing: can data solve all the problems in translation and interpreting, especially in poetry translation? How can we really evaluate the quality of poetry translation when imagery and emotion are involved with cognition, which more or less seems to be subjective? And also, in the age of AI, can human cognition in poetry translation always outweigh AI translation? Or can we say there's no cognition for machines, or machines have their own way of cognize materials? Since it's almost evening time, I will speed up. Wow. So my presentation will go from 4 parts: theoretical foundation, imagery retention and positive emotion change, imagery retention and negative emotion change, as well as conclusion. Okay, so as we all know, imagery is an inescapable topic in the creation of poetry. There is an abundance of imagery in poetry from ancient to modern times, from all over the world. In the translation of poetry, the imagery translation is fairly challenging, as it concerns the cognitive and emotional resonance between the poet, the readers, and the translator. It's not easy to give a clear and mere definition for imagery, since it is sometimes abstract, sometimes specific. Different scholars have different understanding and interpreting for it. In addition, culture is also an important element for consideration. For people have different cognition and experience from different cultural backgrounds. While imagery widely exists in lots of fields. In philosophy, it falls within the realm of philosophy, can be traced back to the book in China, I Ching. It says that there's a connection between meaning and imagery, with imagery being the form and meaning being the essence. And also, philosophy as the realization of enlightenment is an inherent philosophical view in Chinese philosophy. The value of the meaning, the comprehensiveness of thought, and the integrity of structure are all encompassed within the imagery of form, for is what constitutes philosophy of imagery. And in the time of Aristotle, he also identifies one word, fantasia, And maybe we'll find it's very similar to the English words fantasy. And in his understanding, that is the virtue of which an image occurs in us, which comes about through sense perception. And then in psychology, mental image of one's physical appearance, here is from the part of body image, still is something related with our mentality. And all thoughts and mental images, all the contents of consciousness rest not simply on delayed full motor response, external visible, but on delays in the systems of tentative movement. When these systems run smoothly, we have unconscious thought. When delays occur, we have sensations and images. And then in cognition, imagery is the crystallization of imagelistic thinking, and in other words, it is mental image formed within the subject after experiencing and imagining through sensory contact with external object. And by Professor Wen Xu and also his group, imagery is psychological representation that integrates subjects' subjective feelings and emotional connotations which language uses to reflect and correspond to the objects of reference. And by Clark, image is not an entity but a potentiality, and in the specific form or inherited in the anatomical structure of the brain. And in arts and aesthetics, due to the mutual influence between the writer's subjective emotion, known as E, and the objective objects, known as Xiang, the artistic images created by dual meaning, literal and implied, are referred to as imagery. And also, it is created by the subject through emotional response to objects, spiritual insight, and the grasping of the essence of things, reflecting a unique aesthetic thought, process, and creative characteristics, and is a value judgment based on aesthetic experience. And by Kant, aesthetic idea is a representation of the imagination which occasions much thought, but to which no definite thought. And then in literature, once again, by Professor Wen Xu and his group, imagery is the author's externalization in textual expression of the aesthetic imagery they have perceived and experienced through conception, integration, and sublimation. And by the well-known poet, Pound, an image is that which presents an intellectual and emotional complex in an instant of time, and it is not an idea, it is a radiant node or cluster, and he calls a vortex from which and through which and into which ideas are constantly rushing. And the image is more than an idea, it is a vortex. This is a later thinking about image by Pound. And imagery is the residue of sensation. And then that is imagery cognition and its translation in poetics. There are two major pathways, iconicity and metaphorical representation. And in the process of translating poetic imagery, the translator must take their experience of the real world as a backdrop and in junction with the cultural context of the source text, strive to map and convey the imagery from the original text into the target language, considering the poet, the poetic text, and the reader. This aims to reproduce the textual world the poet intends to depict within the poetic text, thereby attempting to faithfully restore the meaning and aesthetic effect of the original poetic imagery and even the cultural spirit. And the role of mental imagery in interpreting poetic metaphors, specifically image metaphors that express mapping of concrete perceptual images from source domains to dissimilar target domains. and also by line brand to advance the investigation of poetic imagery within the study of cognitive semantics and semiotics, an explicit examination of interrelating and literary and meaning production in the poetic text is proposed, instead of merely employing poetry as a means to exemplify concepts in cognitive semantics. Well, in this study, I also need to mention some words for force dynamics in language and cognition by Tommy, for which some of you must be familiar with. Since poetry emotion has close connection with the imagery tension in poetry, in translating the imagery in poetry, the imagery force should be considered, which may influence and help understand and recognize emotion. Well, let's firstly say the steady state force dynamic patterns given by Tommy. And among these patterns, pattern A involves an agonist with an intrinsic tendency towards rest that is being opposed from outside by a stronger antagonist, which thus overcomes its resistance and forces it to move. And in pattern B, the agonist still turns towards rest, but not it is stronger than the force opposing it, so it is able to manifest its tendency and remain in the place. And for pattern C, the agonist's intrinsic tendency is now toward moving, and although there is an external force opposing it, the agonist is stronger, so its tendency becomes realized in resultant motion. And the pattern D shows that while the agonist against has a tendency towards motion, the antagonist is this time stronger and effectively blocks it. And among shifting force dynamic patterns by Tommy, those patterns are a little bit more complex. Pattern E involves a stronger antagonist coming into position against an agonist with an intrinsic tendency towards rest, and thus cause it to change from a state of rest to the state of moving. And in pattern F, the stronger antagonist comes to impingement against the agonist that tends to motion and has been moving, and thus stops it. And in pattern G and H, for pattern G, a stronger antagonist that has been blocking an agonist with a tendency toward motion now disengages and releases the agonist to manifest its tendency. So there is a change of the tendency. And in pattern H, an antagonist that has forcibly kept in motion, an agonist tending toward rest now causes impinging on this agonist and allows it to come to rest. Well, why I mentioned force dynamics here, because it is related with, it's a very important part for cognitive domains, both in native physics and psychology, and it emerges as a fundamental notional system that structures conceptual material pertaining to force interaction in a common way across a linguistic range, the physical, psychological, social, inferential, discourse, and mental model domains of reference and concept. And then how to use force dynamics patterns to analyze the relationship between imagery tension and emotion change in poetry, and how's the translation of poetry imagery. And I will use some examples to interpret it. Well, human cognitions can be expressed positively, or human emotions can be expressed positively and negatively. So there are three situations for the change of positive emotion in poetry. That is positive transfer tendency, negative transfer tendency, as well as reciprocating transfer tendency. So I will focus on the translation of poetic imagery under cognition in line with the emotional expression. And also, I will compare and contrast a little bit about some of the poetry translated by Xu Yuanchong and also AI translation, and so that to say the cognition between human beings and machine translation. Okay, the first one is positive transfer of positive emotion. Well, this is a very famous poem by Li Bai. So from the first and second couplets with the expression of 彩云间 and 一日还, so we can easily say, even with our common sense, the pleasant and relaxed mood of the poet can be felt and represent the positive emotion. And we can regard this emotion as agonist. And then in the third couplet, we will notice the word 原声啼, right? So what's the imagery about yuan in Chinese culture? And it usually implies sorrow, designation, displacement, and something like a negative imagery. However, in the background of the poem, the poet is just absorbed by the government. So this imagery can be thought as the antagonist. And in the last couplet, the poet uses Qingzhou to express again his thrilled and excited mood. This opposed force of the negative image is less, so the resultant emotion has stronger tendency to keep positive. And this is positive transfer of the positive emotion. Well, let's say the translation of Xu Yuanchong for 彩云间, he translated as rainbow cloud. And the AI translation is the rosy cloud. Of course, I searched several AI versions from different apps and softwares, but the difference is one version is rosy clouds. And then for the negative imagery, 原题, how to express it. Xu's version is monkeys, sad audios. But AI version gives most for apes cries, unceasing. And as for the translation of Qingzhou, Xu Yuanchong translated as my boat. And so whether we should translate Qingzhou into my boat, almost a zero translation, or shall we translate it as light boat? In fact, this involved our cognition. And even for the, how to say, for 原题, is it monkey or apes? And so that is what involved our personal ideas. And maybe we cannot agree with each other for which one is better, because the translation of the key imageries is closely related with our personal cognition. And then let's see the second example, the negative transfer of positive emotion. So at the very beginning, that is quite a positive emotion. And then with the block of negative imagery, and so the positive emotion experienced negative transfer, and lastly becomes a kind of negative emotion. For example, in this one, I listed at the very beginning, we know the emotion of the poet, 不知愁. And so that is to say the emotion is a certain kind of happiness. And also judged from the word 凝妆, we know this lady is beautifully dressed, maybe something like that. So, but at the sight of 杨柳色, the last emotion, that is, this lady, the young wife, begins to regret. Well, this is a very obvious change of the emotion. And So the initial delightful emotion of the poet is the agonist. Okay, and Yang Liu is an imagery in Chinese poetry to express missing and sentimental feelings. Here, let's just see a little bit for the translation of Xu Yuanchong and the AI translation. One is green willow leaves, the other is willow hill, and we can judge the difference, which one is better, whether we should translate it as green willow leaves because that is springtime, that's the new beginning of a new year, right? So willow hill is objective but no emotion in it. Well, due to time limit, I just quickly go for the next part. And next one is the reciprocating transfer of positive emotion. So that means the emotion change from positive to negative and then negative to positive lastly. Okay, so I just want to mention one thing for the last translation, the last couplets. 天地肃清堪四望，为君扶病上高台. So how to translate 上高台? Here, Xu Yuanchong translated as mount the tower high, but AI gave us a translation like ascend the tower, spirits soaring high. Well, so in these two contrasts, do you think AI translation give us a clearer connotation of the poet's emotion? And there are some other points. Okay, I don't have enough time. And also, part 3 is about the tension of imagery with negative emotional change. And this is from beginning of a negative emotion and then with active imagery. And also the emotion can experience positive transfer and negative transfer, and as well as reciprocating transfer. So I will not say go details for the example, but here, one, did you say this one? 桃花结子. Wow, that's very interesting. Xu Yuanchong translated as a peach tree bringing the fruit, while the AI gave us peach blossom bearing fruit. So, which one do you agree? 桃花结子, 桃花. So, for this imagery, is it peach tree or peach blossom? Just for your consideration. And also, the other example is about 病树前头万木春. So it is a sick tree or injured tree, or it is just a withered tree, okay? And last one is the reciprocating transfer of negative emotion. Still several changes among negative and positive emotion. Okay, so I will not go for details. And lastly, I just want to say, in many cases within the classical Chinese poetry, to better highlight and emphasize the theme of the poem, emotions as agonist and imagery as antagonist are often in the state of opposition. Positive transfer, negative transfer, as well as reciprocating transfer of poet's emotion can happen under the opposing force of imagery tension. And people have different cognition in translating poetic imagery with different experiences, sensation, and culture. Okay, that's all. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you, Professor Xue. Professor Xue's work is very enlightening as it bridges linguistic theory, cognitive science, and literature translation. And we thank her again for the valuable insights. And now we move on to our last speaker today, Professor Wang Xiangling, and her chair, Professor Zheng Chunping, please.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my great honor to chair the last keynote speaker of today's conference. Our guest speaker is Professor Wang Xiangling from Hunan University. Actually, it's my first time to meet Professor Wang in person, but I have heard a great deal about Professor Wang as a distinguished scholar in the field of translation studies. Professor Wang's biodata is on page 22 of our program book, so I'm not going to read word for word. To sum up, Professor Wang has dedicated her career to research and also education of translation and interpreting for about 30 years. And her achievements have gained her both national and international academic recognition and multiple prestigious awards at the provincial and the national level, particularly including an award winner of the New Century Outstanding Talents Program by the Ministry of Education in China. She has contributed a great number of impressive publications to the field of cognitive research on translation and interpreting. Today, she's going to share her insights on triangulation studies of translators' cognitive resource allocation. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Professor Wang. Welcome.
Okay, thank you very much for your very warm-hearted introduction. I know I'm the last keynote speaker. I try my best to not let you down. Okay, I'll finish as quickly as I can. But first of all, please allow me to show my sincere gratitude to Professor Li Defeng and organizers. They invited me to participate in this great conference. So here I got to visit this beautiful campus to meet well-known professors, old friends, and many promising young people who are willing to devote to cognitive translation and interpreting studies. And, you know, the two professors prior to my speech just reminded me, so I want to take this opportunity to call upon cooperation among different field of scholars. Just now, Professor Xue Yue and also Professor Tan Yesen, they raised a few very interesting theories, profiling theories and imagery theories. So I really like to take this opportunity to say, let me do some empirical studies, either to verify your theories or to falsify. So, because empirical studies are really so intriguing. Okay, so today my topic is to examine translators' cognitive resource allocation in tasks with different levels of topic familiarity. And this talk is based on a paper accepted to be published on the Journal of Foreign Languages, co-authored with my PhD student, Wang Liyang. Okay. I will skip as many pages as I can. Okay, just take a quick look. Now, to start with, I'd like to mention my research purpose. So if you take a look at this purpose and also with the research questions, together with this DV and IV, so you know the only, IV is tasks with varying topic familiarity. And then I have two dependent variables, that's cognitive resources allocation and cognitive processing patterns. And we have triangulated 3 types of data, okay? I will just specify a little bit. With these 2 questions, we seek to construct the translation process model. So these are the 2 research questions. One is, in tasks with different levels of topic familiarity, is there a difference in translators' overall cognitive resource allocation? Specifically, what are the differences in cognitive resource allocated to source text comprehension, target text production, and online information retrieval, respectively? And question 2, in tasks with different levels of topic familiarity, is there a difference in the cognitive processing patterns of translation process based on online information retrieval? Since empirical studies are very often question-driven, okay, questions oriented, so I just took this a few seconds to read the research questions. But I will be happy to skip research background, okay, to save the time. Okay, I'll jump to the methodology. There are altogether 48 translation students as our participants, including 40 females and 8 males. You might take a look. What I want to mention is, I want to mention that we connected the scores in the college English test band 6 and Lextel, and then the result indicated that the English proficiency levels were considered to be comparable, and all participants had similar online information seeking proficiency, and they were paid for the participation. A material. So as I have just clarified, the topic familiarity as the only independent variable. So we paid special attention to this. We adopted 2 English tests with different degrees of topic familiarity, and we use 5-point Likert scale, and then namely text A, familiar one, text B, less familiar one. And then this is the statistics to show the 2 source texts in terms of length, number of sentences, flash reading reads, flash King Cat grade levels, just to show this 2 source text complexity, they are comparable. Only in too many degrees they are comparable, except for topic familiarity. So I'd like to take this chance to briefly introduce this experimental procedure. The experiment lasts approximately 100 minutes. If you take a look at this, they say it's at the bottom, no time constraints. That's why we say approximately. And then participants signed the informed consent, and they were introduced about this experiment, and followed by the first calibration. Then they were given a warm-up task to translate from English into Chinese, which lasts for about 10 minutes, followed by second calibration, and students were asked to conduct the translation text 1, which lasted for 30, okay, and then followed by a questionnaire of familiarity, and then they took a rest, followed by the third calibration, and then they started to translate text 2. And then followed by the translation questionnaire of familiarity. After they finished all these tasks, they took a look to watch the video. So we screen recorded all this process, and they watched the video and they did their own personal retrospective report. So from this procedure, we know this. There are 3 kinds of data: that's eye tracking, and questionnaire, and retrospective. And basically, eye tracking is the most important type of data to answer these questions. So just take a glance of this experiment setting. And then this is a quality assessment of eye tracking data to meet the purpose of this research. So I might skip this. And the result shows that, I come to the result quickly. The result shows that the participants allocated more cognitive resources when performing tasks with a less familiar topic. So this is more like common sense, okay? However, we go specifically into details. So participants needed to invest more cognitive resources to comprehend the ST when translating a less familiar topic. And also participants needed to invest more cognitive resources in producing TT when translating a familiar topic. And also participants needed to invest more cognitive resources to consult information when translating a less familiar topic. Just to save the time, I skipped the many details. I want to show you there is a difference between the results just in terms of different topic familiarity. And this is the patterns. Okay. So this cognitive processing patterns based on the data indicates the topic familiarity greatly influenced participants' source text comprehension. So from here we know the results indicate that the source text, web searching source text pattern is the most frequently used one. I will quickly summarize the discussion since we have already answered the questions. So based on our results, we came to the conclusion that unfamiliar topics impose greater cognitive load on translators. This is the finding aligning with the views of most scholars. Our findings also support the view of schema theory, and we find an interesting finding which indicate familiar topics can enhance behavior and cognitive engagement in TT production. So, yeah, the above findings can be explained through the capacity model for attention. So this morning we got to review Professor Daniel Giller's effort model. So I talked to my student Liang about this. Could we use this capacity model for attention? Use the effort model to replace this one. Yeah, we will think about that. Finally, we come to the cognitive processing patterns, okay. Regardless of different topic familiarity, the cognitive processing patterns were not affected. Yeah, and this can be explained by the asymmetry model of bilingual representation. So this model proposed that for typical unbalanced bilinguals, that's most likely our participants in this empirical study. From L2 to L1, translators needed to mobilize more cognitive resource to identify, comprehend, analyze the linguistic elements of L2 in order to understand the source text. Okay. I finally quickly summarize the implications. For implications, we hope our findings will contribute to a more interesting perspective of bilingual cognitive processing mechanism. Especially, we can pay more attention to our brain's automatic switching or juggling of resources allocation. And also our translation teachers should also pay more attention to our translation students. When we are assigning the translation assignment, we should pay more attention to topic familiarity, extra linguistic knowledge, or encyclopedic knowledge of our students. So in order to achieve better translation competence. Thank you.
Many thanks again to Professor Wang, not only for your inspiring speech, but also your great effort to save time. Thank you so much. As we are coming to the end of today's keynote speech session, may I have the honor to invite all of you to give another round of applause to all the distinguished speakers today for the keynote speech session. Thank you very much. Now let's proceed to the book launch ceremony. Don't have time? No launch today. Okay. We have the chairperson.
I'm sorry for that because the coach will leave at around 6:40 and it won't wait for us. So we have to cut it short today because we don't have time for that. But tomorrow, before the closing ceremony, we will have the book launch. Thank you for that. Would you please move quickly to the coach and follow the lead of the volunteers, students? Thank you very much. Thank you very much.